Welcome. It's great to have you, and we are honored to host this wonderful event. And I'll pass it on to Mr. Jim.
All right. Thank you. Are we good? Are we lit up? Can you hear me? Wonderful acoustic systems in this little 70-year-old building here. It's, by the way, the youngest building on the home tour, so just remember that when we get into it. So appreciate that. And thank you to Christian and the whole community here at First United Methodist who have just jumped in and to help us out on this, and obviously to host in this lovely building. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, as Christian said, as I go through this. And of course, those cushions are important in hour 3 of the talk. So if you just need to get up at some point in there and go back, take a break or whatever, hopefully not quite that bad. But we're gonna cover a lot. We have 7 different properties to talk about on this tour. And of course, the reason we're here is to talk about this wonderful home tour. This will be our 19th annual home tour with La Mesa History Center. I've been involved in all but the first one, even though I helped motivate them to do the first one when I was in the college neighborhoods, and have been involved directly with the organization since into 2008, as board member and other things, and president a couple times, and still on the board. And even though 3 years ago we needed a flat house and a flat neighborhood, we ended up in Kensington. It's okay. It's all right. Yeah, it's okay. And a historic house there, but that's okay. Well, I'm still involved here, obviously, and because there's so much great history. And this is going to be just a little example of how we can do that. And of course, being it's also the 130th anniversary of the first church in La Mesa Springs. You'll hear all about that. It's also the 100th anniversary of the La Mesa Rotary. I don't have any slides, but I wanted to mention that too. We have some anniversaries to the Rotary Club. And then, of course, it's our 50th, the Historical Society, starting back in 1975. And I'll talk a little bit about that as well, and why we're going to have our wonderful museum on the tour as well as 5 wonderful and gems, golden gems. So there's the golden thing, the anniversary, the gems, there's the theme. It's really deep. We put under these themes, right? So we'll have all of that. So I get to it. So let's get to it so we can get this going. And of course, we're really focused on the downtown area, right? The village and all that. And so this is really where La Mesa goes from agricultural community to suburban community. And we're going to talk a lot about this, and we have several houses specifically from this early period, some very significant individuals. It's going to allow me to tell you a little bit about who those movers and shakers were, the institutions and all the organizations, and then of course the builders and the contractors and the architects who designed all these wonderful homes and built all these homes that are still around for us today to enjoy. And so you're going to get to learn a little bit about all this little bit of subdivisions that surround us here in originally La Mesa Springs. Of course, the history of this area goes far back, as if you talk to the Kumeyaay, it's time immemorial for them. This is where it all began. And of course, archaeologically, we know at least probably close to 15,000 years, there's been the human habitation of our native friends and colleagues, and they're part of this story. And that world, of course, changed significantly with the arrival of the Spanish colonial missionaries and soldiers in 1769, the establishment of the mission system in the Spanish period, and then later the ranchos of the Mexican period, when private property was then driven. Once Mexico had received its independence from Spain, they began to see private landholding. Previous to that, the church or the king owned all the land. Here you began to see Mexican republicanism here in the territory of Alta California, which was the farthest northern territory during the Mexican Republic, until the Americans arrived during the war with Mexico, occupied California, and eventually purchasing it right at the end of the war there. And of course, one of those ranchos was given to Santiago Arguello. He had been the commandant of the Presidio on the hill there above Old Town State Historic Park. And if you don't know, I happen to work for state parks. I've been working for them for 29 years as a historian. So if I can plug a state park, I will. So if you want to go visit Old Town State Historic Park, you can learn a lot more about all that pioneering story as well here in San Diego. But certainly these ranchos were sort of key pieces of private land, at which mostly cattle hides were the main thing that you could ship back east from California in that period. And if you see the boundary on there between the Pueblo lands, which is now the city, and the Rancho lands, that canyon is actually roughly where the 805 passes today. A nice geographic split there. And so the Pueblo lands to the west, the Mission lands to the east, of which most of the city of La Mesa sits within today from this Rancho grant. Right after occupation, the U.S. put in quite a bit. Even though the treaty guaranteed these land grants, they put in what we might say is a very onerous prospect to get the title cleared for these. This case of the ex-Mission Rancho took 32 years to clear in court. That's a long time. That's a lot of lawyer fees, I can tell you that. But in the meantime, it didn't stop people, heirs of the family and others who had purchased land within there, to sell it off. And two key people who purchased the land was a guy named John Harbison, who bought about 4,000 acres. It's now mostly what's northern La Mesa into college neighborhoods. And then Robert Allison, whose land basically from about what we call the Cajon Road or University Avenue south all the way down into Lemon Grove. And he had about 4,000 acres as well. Harbison was a beekeeper. He actually patented some apiaries for raising bees and stuff. And Allison was a stockman. He owned butcher shops downtown. He owned land at the Rancho Cuyamaca. He owned land in Campo. He owned land, this 4,000 acres, to run his sheep and cattle that he would use for his meat business downtown, back when most people at the time were living downtown. So to give you an idea, in 1870, I think the population of the city of San Diego at that time had risen to a whopping about 2,500, and the county was just maybe double that at that time. So still pretty sparsely, very rural and very sparsely populated folks, okay? So if you were here in the 1870s, 80s, you would be on the Mesa. And the Mesa term comes actually from those missionaries who moved their mission from down near Old Town, the Presidio, up to where it currently is, where the river makes that big bend there. There was a big, large Indian village there where they were trying to convert the neophytes. And there, they would look then to the south up on this tableland, La Mesa, that pretty much encountered them would have been anything from about Mission Hills up to Mount Helix. And that was the sort of general, that's the Mesa, right? And that's where the name La Mesa is going to come from, even though it's very focused now here in the city. That's where that came from, right? And so you would have seen things. And there were two main routes to get from downtown as you're moving east, and they will converge right at what was called Allison Springs, which was at the sort of northwest corner of Allison's properties. And that was the Choyas Road, which you all know is University Avenue and that way, and then the Cajon Road via the Mesa or the El Cajon Boulevard. And that was established in the early 1880s. And so this was the tour, and they sort of converged at about where Allison Springs was, all right? Interestingly enough, during all those court cases, the area around Spring Valley was identified early as not being within any rancho boundaries. And so it actually has some of the earliest settlement because the land was technically available. And so you see one of the first schools, first sort of homesteading, all in those lands that didn't have any conflict with mission title or rancho titles. And so that's sort of an interesting little piece of why it sort of started up as the initial. And the other reason was the Spring Valley name is very apt because there are lots of springs in that area, obviously draining both from up here in the Mesa and the springs around us right here, which we have several, still one flowing in Collier Park today, as well as those that would coming out of the Sweetwater River, of course, where they would put a big dam eventually in 1888, right? So sort of that water is very key to all this back then. And then you'll hear a little bit about the water stories as we go through it. Speaking of water, once the great boom of the 1880s hit Southern California, and that's triggered by the arrival of the railroads to Southern California, first to Los Angeles. And if you've ever been to Los Angeles State Historic Park, that was the first big rail yard in downtown LA. The Southern Pacific got there first, cut across the desert and cut out San Diego, who always thought they were going to be the terminus of the southern route because we had this wonderful natural bay and Los Angeles didn't have one. Didn't work out that way eventually. Angeles had enough money to build their own harbor, right? It's a pretty big one if you may have seen it recently. So that sort of was going on. So the recognition here that what you needed to make things go, and suddenly that boom reduces the cost for people to get, especially from the Midwest through the Santa Fe Railroad competing with the Southern Pacific. They end up putting terminus at National City, and so there's competition. And suddenly what used to cost $50, which was big money to travel out, became $1 or $2 fare from Chicago to Southern California. And so people start moving out there. It also begins the sort of promotion of Southern California as this place that, one, has no weather. That's a good thing if you're living in the Midwest, right? And two, it's this idyllic city where it's always sunny and you can grow, orange trees and lemon trees year round, as big as, globes, right? And send them off, make lots of money sending them back to New York in the winter when people will pay big money for that kind of stuff. So citrus is actually the first boom industry in American Southern California, the railroads, et cetera. So you can go to California Citrus State Historic Park if you want to hear that story too. It's really good in Riverside. So that's sort of what's going on, and San Diego's going to join in this, and suddenly people are coming up, buying up lands, subdividing it all. And what you need to support that, of course, if you're especially going to do agriculture or towns, is you need water. And remember, we don't get a whole lot of rain here. We average about 10, 11 inches of rain. And some smart guy named Theodore Van Dyke and his partner William Robinson realized, but it rains about 20 to 25 inches up in the Cuyamaca Mountains. So if we can get the water from up here down there, down to here, from up there down to here, hey, this is a good thing. So they form in 1885 the San Diego Flume Company with just that. There's a little laguna. It's now Lake Cuyamaca, you know it, next to the park there. And they dam that up, create a diversion dam you see in here. Then through a series of tunnels and flumes, they're going to bring all that water down and drop it off at its terminus, which is today, it was known as the Eucalyptus Reservoir, which today is Briarcrest Park, right up here in La Mesa. And from there, they were going to run a ditch down to Allison's land, because he was a partner in this, down through his lands into Lemon Grove, and another one across the Mesa top to an area they called the Mesa Reservoir, which you all know today as Lake Murray. Right. So they had this all planned, and by February of 1889, they had completed this system and got it ready to go, and were ready to start cutting contracts to people. So of course, being the smart folks, not only did they know they could sell water, they also needed a couple other things to make this work. The other thing you needed in 19th century communities to succeed besides water, of course, was the railroad. And Governor Waterman, who by the way owned the mines up at Cuyamaca and was related to Mr. Allison by marriage, decides he's going to figure out a way to get that connecting rail line from San Diego out to connect to the Southern Pacific and head east on the Southern Transcontinental route. So he begins, and he gets as far as what's called Foster, which is just on the other side of the San Diego River from Lakeside. And in June of 1889, that line is completed out to that point, and along the way, the route ends up going not where a lot of folks hoped, as I'll mention in a minute, but down the route, you know it, and this is the trolley line today. This is the same route that the Metropolitan Trolley runs on today, that goes through Encanto, Lemon Grove, up in here into Allison Springs at that time, over the hill, down into Coan Valley, out past into Lakeside, etc., right? And that opens that, and of course, right here is where that route is. So that route isn't where something else is I'm going to mention in a minute, but this is another key. So you got the water going, you got the railroad. 1889, great thing except for one, the great boom that had drawn San Diego's population in 1885 was figured to be about 5,000. By the height of the boom in early 1888, it was reported to be close to 40,000, right? People were rolling in here. This is where the first water systems, sewer systems, trolley lines, all this starts happening in San Diego, right? And so that's going, except in late 88, it busts. And by 89, it's down and people are walking away from property, and there are lots of paper subdivisions with nothing going on. And so it's sort of, they go for the boom to the bust, right in time for these two systems to be completed. In the meantime, the Flume Company had purchased Mr. Harbison's 4,000 acres, laid out a town site along the Cajon Road. It would be centered on today's 70th and El Cajon Boulevard. You see that as the town site, with plans for the big reservoir uphill. There's eucalyptus, and then starts dividing outside of that into 5 and 10 acre lots, because the assumption is they're going to sell to citrus farmers, right? They're going to get that. They're going to join into the big boom here in Southern California. Fortunately, they're missed out on the big boom, but they get it going, and this is what gets started. And of course, that is in fact where the original La Mesa town site was to be. Up there, and that grid of streets is still there. It's known as 67th through 73rd Street, 2 blocks north and 1 block south of El Cajon Boulevard, and that grid is still on the map, and that was the La Mesa town site. By 1891, there's enough folks to create a school district, the La Mesa School District up there, right? As well as eventually a church and other businesses that supported this rural agricultural, mostly guys trying out the citrus industry, trying to figure out if they can break into that and make some money as everyone else. This is the kinds of properties that were out at that point. DeWitt Williams, if you know DeWitt Street and Williams Street up north off Elkin Boulevard here to the west, that's where his ranch was. The Schuyler's, the Lookout Ranch, and actually James Schuyler is the engineer who built the Sweetwater Dam in 1888, at the time the largest masonry dam in the country, and still there, still working. And his ranch was just to the east of us here. If you were on a tour 2 years ago, if you came to our tour, that's the Roach House, Henry and Sarah Roach, known later by the Porter family who purchased it, and the Porter Hill. I'll talk a little bit about that. And of course, if you've ever gone to dinner at Anthony's, you look out at that pond, which is a natural spring-fed pond that Hervey Park, who is heir to the Park Davis pharmaceutical money, came out here and put a little gentleman's ranch in there, dammed that up, used that water so he didn't have to hook up into the flume system, and built a nice little ranch here where he would come out during the winter and hang out for a bit. So this is the kind of development you're seeing. Still very rural. it's estimated in 1900s, maybe 100 people living in the general area, not counting Native Americans. And so that sort of gets you. Now, in the meantime, we're down here, right? We're in Allison Springs, where the railroad station, just up the street over here, right, ends up coming here. And this is the Allison station, right? And Robert passes away, but his son James connects with the guy who buys the Lookout Ranch, Andrew Crowder, who decide that they're going to do something about this. We've got the depot, and it just worked out because out of the depot, the post office also ends up here. And they named the post office La Mesa because they didn't want to call it Allison, and you'll see here the little name issue. And so you have the La Mesa school and everything over there, and down here you've got the post office at Allison Springs. So there's a name challenge. So what they want to name it, they think about, should we keep Allison Springs? Nah. Crowderville? No, not Crowderville. And so they go, well, let's just go La Mesa Springs. But they couldn't name the post office La Mesa Springs because there was already one somewhere else in the U.S. Anyway, so you have the confusion. You got the church and the school, it's La Mesa, and you got the post office, it's La Mesa, it's here in La Mesa Springs, right? So this is going to be a little bit of fun that challenges that for a while. Quickly, Crowder and a couple of our investors formed the La Mesa Lemon Company. They build their office, their store and the packing house, which is a very important building, as you'll hear in a minute, to the community. And that gets going in 1894, and they officially change the name and run that little subdivision of a couple of blocks around the depot and name it La Mesa Springs in 1894. So if you look at La Mesa Springs, and this is probably the earliest decent shot we have of it, give you an idea, the store, and that's of course across this packing house, long gone. The store has been expanded. It was expanded later. It's still under there. It's where the dog washing place is, right? Where the Lookout Ranch, and of course the Rush Ranch, which is its own story and fun story. But you can see not a lot of development. Still see some citrus orchards out there, right? And all flattened up, ready to go in that direction, right? Take it back, looking west a couple years later, you'll see a few things that have added. One is the Allison School District. There's enough people who have moved in by this point that they decide they can't, and they don't want to send them all the way up there to the La Mesa School. So they create a new school, but they can't call it La Mesa School because it's up there. So they call it the Allison School. And that Allison School District name will actually stay with the local school district until 1932. So you're getting a feel. A few more things coming in, a few more orchards planted out there. You begin to see sort of the community beginning to build up. They even have enough folks to have a baseball team, et cetera, right? Things are happening. So, of course, one of the things that a community needs, the schoolhouse, which is very valuable to any rural community, especially 19th century U.S., is it's used for just about everything. It's the place where you go to vote. It's the place where you go to church. It's the place where kids go to school. It's sort of the main first community building. In the meantime, the different religious denominations begin to looking for a place to go. And the first one will be up at La Mesa. It gets certified in October of 1895, and it's the La Mesa Congregational Church, but up at La Mesa. So they have they're the first in the area up at La Mesa. So they get there first, okay? So they're down the street here, and they want their credit, so just give them a second. So that's up there. So they're first, and they actually beat the church here at La Mesa Springs by about a month, because the Methodist Episcopal get their official approvals from the conference in November of 1895, and so they're the first church at La Mesa Springs, so they're both first. So yeah, we'll work this out for them, right? And of course, being it's still a small community, for the first maybe 10 or so years, or 10 or 12 years, the Methodist Church folks here in the county send them what were known as supply ministers. In other words, it wasn't a big enough congregation. They didn't have their own building or any of that kind of thing. So they would just send folks out to do, services over the years, and they would come in, and sometimes they lived here and sometimes they didn't, and they would come and allow the services could occur, right? And we see those sort of notes here. There are a couple of places then in these early years that the Methodist Episcopal Church, which is going to be this church, this is where the 130 years comes in, right? They would sometimes hold services at the school. They would often hold services at the Mesa Hall, which was the second floor, a very smart move by the Lemon Company to create the second floor as a big open hall that served for church services, dances, lectures, all kinds of things. It was a community center, in effect, back then for the community. Until finally in 1908, the church is able to purchase the property across the street here and build their first church. You see there in the center of the photo, that's their first formal building as the Methodist Episcopal Church, its name at the time. And there's a good picture of it, and it sat right across the street. And so that was a big deal. That was the first time the church had its own building, They had grown enough to be able to have that and that. And I'll get back to the story of the church a little bit later. But one of those supply ministers was a guy named Henry McKinney, right? And his wife, Florence, they're from Illinois. They'd married, and she was a school teacher. They ended up having 3 boys. And they, for health reasons, this used to be a thing in the 1880s in the Midwest. If you had any kind of lung or those kind of conditions, the doctors would give you a prescription to move to California. This is real. And so the health move was actually a big drawing, folks, and why also from the boom of the 80s into the 20s, the largest groups of immigrants to California, especially Southern California, were from the Midwest groups. And that's why you would have Iowa clubs and Illinois clubs and all those kinds of things, right? A lot at the time. They started some little parade, I think, in Pasadena or something eventually. So you're getting that idea what's going on, right? And so they originally settled in National City. He was sent out to be a supply minister here in 1898-99. Again, when he was reassigned in 1901, he decides to move the family here, and they end up coming in and staying and becoming important folks, as you'll hear, in the history of the community and the church here. In fact, they end up trying to get into the business, right? They buy about 2.5 acres along the Cajon Road there, and in 1908 complete their house and put out, as you can see, about 2 acres in lemons. San Diego County tended to do lemons because you needed more water to get citrus sweeter, and so lemons weren't as sweet, so they tended to be lemon grove and Chula Vista, mostly lemons, though they did also, folks did oranges, but mostly lemons was what was going on here. And so that's a wonderful house, and you guys will, of course, get a chance to see it because it's going to be open again for the tour, and we'll talk a little bit more. So this will be one of our stops to celebrate our 50th, but also tell you a little bit about the history of the McKinneys and a little bit more about history of the Historical Association here. All right? So, of course, what's going on? Well, a few more folks are moving into the general La Mesa area. In 1902, the formation of the La Mesa Women's Club, still the oldest standing service organization in the area, back to 1902. Baseball, because baseball, is a big thing, right? And of course, expanding the school, et cetera, et cetera. Things are happening in the Progressive Era. And in this, one of the things that comes out of Progressive Era is the idea of what's called the 6-class cities. Laws are passed that allow communities of 700 or less to incorporate and therefore take over some local control, which was a big part of, back then, the progressive movement of trying to get control, understanding all the things you want to happen in your community, and make sure it isn't somebody from somewhere else making those calls. It's a big part of that movement. And was sort of, so we'll say a little more liberal concept of the local organization at that time, right? So you're seeing that sort of movement going on, and La Mesa sort of falls into that. And that's why in about 1906, things started to change. And one of the things that had changed all that was that there had been a drought from about 1897 to 1904 here in San Diego County that really decimated the citrus industry here, and really questioned the ability of San Diego to be able to join in the way that the wealth was pouring into Riverside and Orange and Los Angeles and Ventura counties from the citrus industry, right? And so the idea, though, that as people were beginning to move here, and this was just right after the announcement of the Panama Canal, San Diego's the first port, they're getting all excited, they're going to do this exposition, all these things, tension starts coming to San Diego, and people want to live here. Because the other reason we mentioned, we got no weather. That's another reason, right? So you see it, and this is sort of the landscape that's going to suddenly build up from those empty orchards and fields that you saw there. And the first guy who sort of gets this wind is a guy named D.C. Collier, known as Charlie. His father had been early developers of Ocean Beach during the boom. They also had just opened about the same. They opened a little thing along the trolley line called Normal Heights, if you know up East San Diego, Mid-City. He had bought land in Ramona. In fact, there's a Collier Park in Ramona as well. And he gets in. He ends up buying a bunch of the land over here outside of La Mesa Springs and buys up part of the old Lookout Ranch, etc. And one of the things he sort of announces in about 1906-07 is that he's going to create his own country estate over in this area just to the southeast of us here. And he's going to make it in. He brings in this noted landscape architect from New York named George Cook. Now, Cook had been brought to San Diego with a guy named Samuel Parsons, another famous landscape architect around 1902 or 3, to help design what was then the empty city park. We know it now as Balboa Park, right? And to do something. What are you going to do with this great piece of land that has great potential, right? So, of course, as any good designer would do, he gets a few side jobs, right? And one of them is to work here for Mr. Collier in laying out his country estate, right? And they're going to, and it just happens, and if you go to Collier Park today, of course, the spring's still flowing water. And so they were talking, well, we'll bottle the water, we'll go ahead and build you this lovely estate, we'll plant all kinds of wonderful crops, and it'll be just a great thing to get that going. So he has Cook lay this all out, etc. And they start working on it, and they build the spring house, which is still available. I'll talk about that. It's still the one building left from this period. Unfortunately for Collier, as well as for Mr. Cook, Cook gets the job to work with the county on starting to laying out the road system. And as he's traveling on a job east, looking at the grades through Alpine, his horse carriage flips, he's injured, and he ends up dying from the injuries. He has another little piece of La Mesa I'll talk about that, but it's very sort of sets it back. It's also always historians will wonder what would have happened if Cook had stayed around. Would he have gotten, likely because of Collier, ends up becoming one of the main managers of the exposition. The assumption is Cook would have been involved in picking all the designers and all that in Balboa Park. Maybe it looks a little different, who knows? But anyway, so that's sort of an interesting little piece. So that sort of puts Collier's plans on hold, as well as the fact that he's about to be sort of brought in to be the main guy pushing to get the exposition here in San Diego for 1915. So what Collier does, he tells the young community, look, if you guys incorporate, I'll deed you this land for a park. And that's how Collier Park is eventually going to become part of the city and the oldest park in the city. He offers this in 1910. They begin to work on it. And as I said, there's a picture. You can see the spring house back there, the last little piece. And if you didn't know, there's actually a plan we worked hard to put into the plan about 12 years ago that we want to save that the spring house. And all the reuse planning is going on right now. You can go onto the website and put your comments in, and we're helping out to figure out how and what we want to do with that building once we get it restored. So that's a great work that the City Park and Rec Department is working on with consultants, IS Architecture, who long time know historic preservation architects, it's going to be a great plan. And so we're very excited to see that going as well these days. So what's going on there, right? Okay. The other thing Collier does is he ends up selling a big chunk of property to a couple guys named Park and Grable. This is in the spring of 2006, and he ends up selling several hundred acres to these guys. And the story is, of course, they came in saying, hey, I'm looking for a nice house spot or something. And he said, no, you guys know something about real estate. You each got to buy at least 100 acres and subdivide it and get this thing going. So all our land is going to become more valuable. They bite on this idea, by the way. They lay out their first subdivision on the east side of Spring Street called Park's Addition, and the one on the west side called Grable's Addition, the first suburbs, I like to say, of La Mesa. And then they start working on cleaning things up and getting all of the things in order to subdivide and then hopefully start building houses around here. So who are these guys, right? Well, Clarence Charles, known as CC, actually was a Kansas native. He moved out and ended up starting to ranch in 1892 in the Otay Nestor area south of here. Does that for a while, and then decides to give up that sort of thing. It was probably at the end of the drought. He figured it wasn't going to work out too well. He ends up moving to Logan Heights, which was a burgeoning outside of the town subdivision of San Diego. Think about that today, right? And ends up getting a job as a manager at the Russ Lumber Company, the largest lumber company in San Diego at the time. Sherman Grable was an Ohio native, as was his wife Lillian. They had lived in Nebraska and in Colorado, and they end up moving to Logan Heights in 1902, where he ends up giving up on, he had a very large, nice ranch up in Colorado. In fact, when we look at them in the 1900 census, it's them, their two sons, and 3 servants. So they were doing okay. They were doing okay in Colorado. But suddenly they need to move to San Diego, we think possibly for some health issues as well. And he ends up deciding to get into the boom and opens a real estate and insurance business and begins developing houses in Logan Heights first and property, right? And so they're the ones who are going to come in and start buying up all this land and start subdividing it into all kinds of, tracts to fill in and create, and not as 5 and 10 acre, ranch tracts, but as housing lots, right? Suburban housing lots. And interesting enough, one of their tracts, the Lookout Park tract, which is the one that encompasses the sort of slopes of Lookout of Mount Nebo over here to the west of us, they have George Cook lay that out. And everybody always asks me, well, who came up with this idea of these pedestrian staircases up this hill? George Cook did. This was a cutting-edge suburban design to address, because even in 1907, most people didn't have cars. You didn't drive around hillside. So this is the idea, and we see them up there. We see it extended in the Windsor Hills track in the 20s. You see it over in Rolando, which is a mid-20s track, where they put in this so that you want to see your neighbors and you're on a slope, you needed a way to cut through and get down. So this was a really cutting-edge suburban thing, and Cook had done that and laid that out for them on their top land. And of course, Mount Nebo. Here we are. What a great marketing tool, right? The place where Moses saw the promised land. By a lot, you can see the promised land, right? I mean, that's just made for marketing for you, Mount Nebo, right? So anyway, there we go. All right. And of course, Park Grable is going to just dominate mass. They're still selling property down in Logan Heights. They have a big office in East San Diego. They're looking around, but La Mesa, since they have bought in so well, this is the push. And they're going to, and you'll see these ads, and they end up buying a fleet of automobiles, buses, to trek people from wherever to come out and see those lots in La Mesa. And of course, and entice them with Mr. Hawley's strawberries. The Hawley Ranch was out near where the Ford dealership there in the interchange, and they supposedly grew strawberries the size of, oranges or something. Anyway, there was they would tell you all this kind of good stuff and bring you out and you get some ice cream and strawberries and look to pick out that lot, to buy. But they also took to be the full service. They also informed the thing called the Improvement Club, which becomes the Chamber of Commerce, right? To push business and that. They also formed their own bank, the Bank of La Mesa. As you'll see there, Grable Park and all the Park sons, and of course, Grable sons are all part of that board, right? And Park decides to move and create his own lumber company, and we all know it as the La Mesa Lumber Company, formed 1907, one of our sponsors of the tour this year, once again, as well as they're both members of the Methodist Episcopal Church, and they are help get it organized and formally incorporated, which helped them to get the funds to build the church building across the street. So they're very involved, as you might guess, right? They also put on some fun events. They have about 4 years. They run 4th of July celebrations, and they haul people out here. People come on the train, but also they bring people out, and they have big celebrations with all of this flow. And of course, if you want to buy a lot, we sure appreciate it, as well as setting up things like cleanup days and stuff to promoting that this is a happening place where you want to live, you want to come build your house and live here in La Mesa Springs. Such by 1910, as this says, it's an ideal and thriving suburban town, which of course, this is probably half ad and half article, but that's the way it went back there in the good old days of that, and showing that the houses and that the city that this town is starting to fill up quickly. By this time, there's probably about 500 people living in the general area, which is getting close to that goal of 700 so that they can incorporate. So, and that happens in February of 1912. They had over 700 residents. And the other thing that helped them was in October of 1911, California became the 6th state or territory to give women suffrage. They could now vote. And so the great story, I did a whole lecture on this about talking about the incorporation, was 2 days after that election the news came in that ladies now had the right to vote. A group of about 30 of them hopped on the train, went downtown to the courthouse, registered to vote, and signed the incorporation petitions as legal voters, right? Helps your numbers come up, right? Yay. That's right. And so in February, a quick move, they voted it. Only a few dissenters not wanting to tax ourselves. That's crazy, right? But most people were like, this is a good thing, self-control or whatever. And so in February of 1912, the city of La Mesa is formed. And they kick with the name La Mesa, not La Mesa Springs, because the post office was called La Mesa. This will force the folks up at La Mesa to change their school and their community's name into La Mesa Heights. The name it will hold pretty much into the 30s when San Diego State moves out there and it becomes sort of subsumed into the college area, right? And they end up annexing that way. So give you an idea, there's sort of a look at what the town looked like from up on top of Mount Nebo, looking down, a couple of the key buildings, etc., and the Methodist Church there you can see across the street from us. Meantime, of course, Park Grable is doing pretty well. You can see they end up moving their offices from Logan Heights to Broadway, which was then known as D Street. They incorporate formally. They have offices in East San Diego as well as the one downtown, their fleet of cars taking people around to their properties, et cetera, et cetera. And then finally in 1916, Mr. Park decides he just had enough of the real estate business. He's just going to stick with the bank, let his sons run the lumber company. So they disassemble the Park Grable, and it becomes the Grable, Blyfus, and Francisco Company, basically the same company, just different partners in it, and they continue to go. And so needing an office here, as well as the bank needing stuff, they turned to this fellow who was a very popular architect at the time in San Diego and was doing some cutting-edge stuff named Irving J. Gill. And we have clear documentation that the building on the right, that the bank building was definitely him, and we believe there's pretty good evidence that he probably also did the similarly styled Park Grable office there. The only other building we had known that we could document that Gill had done was that La Mesa Heights School, which was completed in 1911. It looks a little bit like a small version of the Bishop's School in La Jolla that, of course, was built in 1909 over there. That same sort of austere style that really gives us all that Gill was probably, as many architectural historians will say, was sort of a proto-modernist, right? He was the guy who was doing the things that was still way ahead of its time, right? He's an interesting guy, and I'll talk a little bit about it. So these were the three buildings that we pretty much had concern that this was all had long gone. The bank buildings were replaced, and the bank in the 20s, and in 1940, the La Mesa High School was torn down for a lovely streamline by William Templeton Johnson. Not too bad if you're going to lose something. But anyway, that's what happened to those. And so the assumption that we didn't have any Gills left. But I'll just tell you that Irving Gill is an interesting guy. He actually was New York born, but he was trained in Chicago under the schools with Louis Sullivan and Frank Lloyd Wright, and brought this and looked at what was going on in Europe to bring that austere style to you. In 1910, he's sort of at his height here in San Diego, and he's really challenging the development and the architecture business. This concept of poured concrete slab tilt-up construction, which was freaking out the building inspectors in San Diego, whose ordinances said you got to have stud walls, and he said, I don't need stud walls, it's concrete. Oops. And then he's like, oh, come on. What are you talking? You guys are knuckleheads. This is going to work, right? And of course, he was freaking people out with that stuff. The other one in the picture, of course, is he was the one who built the lighted fountain. And in 1910, there was great concern that you connected electricity and water. This was not a good thing. And he said, no, we can do this. This is how you design it. This is going to be okay. And so he was making a lot of roads. He was also making some enemies, shall we say, as well. But very controversial. And his homes were this, and he was building churches and all kinds of other great buildings. So let's see if we can get into something. Okay. In the meantime, that's who Gill is, right? And we know about his buildings and everything else. Sherman Grable wants to build a house, and he wants to actually build an estate house to show, what he's doing as a leader. The first house he built was over on Date Avenue. So he sells it in 1909 because he's engaging, and the newspapers are talking about he's about to build his new big house up on the hill just south of here, right? So he sells the house, and he's living down the street, waiting for this house to be built, right? Okay, and this is a very gorgeous house. It's sort of a prairie-influenced Tudor, and when the house was actually put on the register, it's the second property to get listed. McKinney House was the first. This is the second to get listed as a historic landmark. And I knew some of the folks who did this, and these a lot thinner reports back in 1985, but they just sort of speculated. They said, well, it sure looks kind of similar to Gill stuff. Well, it resembles some stuff, but they had no documentation. They had no notices of completion. They had no records of it, nothing from newspapers, nothing in anything that gave us hard documentation that house was designed by Irving Gill. And a few people were a little concerned because, it's kind of too Tudorish. Wasn't he doing all this very austere stuff? I'm not sure. But the reality is he actually was still designing houses like this, and that's a picture of one he had designed in 1910 in Coronado, which was Tudor style similar to this house. So the question was, can we document this, right? Well, guess what? Oh, okay, well, I'll just give you a little quick. So this search went on, and about 10 years ago when the house was on the tour before, I did some research. That time I was able to do word searches in the San Diego Union, but not the Tribune or the Sun. And I still found nothing. I mean, I changed out misspelled words, tried anything I could to see if something would come up, right? Nothing. But subsequently, the Tribune and the San Diego Sun have been digitized. And the Tribune didn't give me anything, but this popped up in the Sun. A full feature article on Mr. Grable's house with a photo. Unfortunately, the microfilm wasn't that great, so you can't see it in the photo, but it's very similar to the photo on the right. And right there in paragraph 2, this house was designed by Irving J. Gill. This is the first hard documentation that this house is a Gill. I tell you, I'm getting emails from folks all over about, hey, wow, this is amazing. We found one. Because there's so many that have been lost, and everybody's always excited. And Gill was such a cutting-edge architect. And unfortunately for Gill, he made some enemies in his years. He ended up going to Los Angeles and trying some big community planning stuff and didn't go too well for him. And by the 20s, he sort of was kind of pariahed out in some ways from the architecture committee. And he ends up dying in the 30s, pretty well unknown, until architectural historians, Esther McCoy and others in the late 50s said, this guy was cutting edge. Why is nobody talking about him? He was doing amazing stuff. And so this came out. So this was out. And of course, it also gives us an amazing details of the interior details and the landscape, and just wonderful feature article here, as well as listing that the contractor was a guy named J.B. Davis, which I will tell you a little bit about, and then R.A. Keynes, who was the construction manager, who was also the construction manager at the time at Collier Park, right? He's the local guy who knows how to manage construction. So this was a big step, and certainly now we can say that, in fact, La Mesa still has a Gill, and if you come on the tour, you're going to get a chance to see it. John B. Davis is one of those early contractors in this little community who comes out, and the stories are a lot similar, you'll see here, a native of Oklahoma. He marries Mabel Donahue and in 1902, and they come out along with Mabel's brother, Thomas, who ends up building a blacksmith shop, and Davis goes into the construction business, right? In 1919, they go to the big pond of LA and move up there where there's way more people and more opportunities, and this happens with a lot of folks. Gill tried it. Cliff May will eventually do it later in the 30s, right? Because the pond is just a lot bigger up there, right? And so Davis, and he does some of the most notable houses and properties. He ends up building the contractor for the Grossmont Inn, the Grable House, one I just found on 4th, the Skinner House, and this picture, the Armour House, who the family just reached out to us about, I don't know, maybe 2 months ago with a photo of saying, do you know where this house is? So no, let's look into it, and found out it's actually over near Rolando. It's in Rolando, sort of, close to where it is now Clay Park and now Pendleton Elementary. We've been in that area over there before that all went in the 20s. And just a wonderful home, and they sent us another photo there. So Davis ends up becoming an important contractor. He's the guy who builds the Grable House. Now, the Grables, of course, enjoy this. They move in July of 1910. There's a picture of Sherman and Lillian with their 2 boys, Frank and Ray. And as you can see, it sits at the time, nestled by itself on top of about a 15-acre property at the time. And of course, you can see that photo with Lillian's father in the front there, shortly after it was constructed in 10. Here's a few other shots early on, and just give you an idea of this, and it still very much looks this way. Certainly, and a big push, of course, was the indoor-outdoor lifestyle, right? Remember, this is pre-air conditioning era, right? And so the idea to have cut porches and things you could do in the summer, easy to block up if it's cool in the winter or whatever, and just allows that California indoor-outdoor lifestyle. So really a piece of architecture for La Mesa. And of course, Sherman and Lillian are interesting stories. As I mentioned, they possibly wanted this to sort of replicate what they had in Colorado, which was a large estate ranch north of Denver at Larimer, and with their merchants' rights. So certainly I think this could have sort of fit into the sort of their dream of what they were originally wanting when he said, I'm looking for a house lot. Okay, I got to subdivide and create the town in the meantime, but here's how we're going to fund it, right? And so, of course, it is a place that gets used for all kinds of promotional events as well as personal and private events. And you can see they start landscaping it and really turn it into this wonderful place. It gets used for everything from women's club meetings, Valentine teas, 4th of July celebrations, etc., open houses to promote La Mesa, etc., as well as private entities, including son Frank and his wife Fern's marriage in 1917. Their wedding is held there. One of my favorite, there's a picture of the engaged couple there below, who were good friends with Cromwell McKinney and his future wife, Marie, because they all went to the same church, right? And Cromwell's the oldest son of Henry, right? So there's a lovely photo there. And of course, my favorite, the shot of the wedding party with somebody's editorial across the top there. If you can see it, it says, "She married the richest boy in town." That's a double life score on the Scrabble board of life, right? There we go. So anyway, she's very pretty. I'm sure it was more than that. But anyway, and they in fact had a long marriage and children and all that good stuff, right? Now, some of the other stuff as I started digging a little more into this is that as early as 1916, Grable puts the property up for sale. So it could have been it also was taxing them a little bit from a financial spot to keep the place rolling. And it doesn't look like until 1918 that somebody bites on it. And a fellow from Chicago named Birch just says he's going to open it up as sort of a resort place, right? It's going to be sort of a resort. All I can tell you is there's very little in the paper about Birch and what's going on there. In 1920, though, the Grables are renting a house on Fairview down the street from Frank and Fern. But by 1922, they're going to end up back in the house, and they're going to live there for another 10 years. So an attempt to sort of turn it into something else and maybe move on didn't quite work out. But anyway, just fun of the story. And of course, this picture, and in fact, there's an article here in 1924 where they go into great detail about how wonderful the gardens are, how beautiful it is, and how it's the perfect country estate, and that the father of La Mesa, Sherman, and his wife Lillian are still living there and enjoying the property. And as you can see from that sort of low-angle aerial, the place was certainly built out and landscaped well. They will sell the house in 1932. Lillian passes in 1936. I believe 1946 for Sherman. And a couple of other families will take it long-term. The Westbrooks are there quite a while, as well as the Hutchins. I don't know if Hutch is out there, who lived there for an extended period of time. Our current owners have bought it about 10 years ago and have done amazing updates and preservation work, got it updated a little bit, and you are going to really enjoy if you want to come out and see this house. It's just fantastic. And there's a few little shots today, thanks to our photographer, Stephen Churchill. All of these new shots you see of the houses, these are from Stephen. And just give you an example of everything from the landscape to the interiors, etc. Now, of course, not everybody's building their estate house, right, at this time. Some are just building standard little houses, bungalows, California bungalows. Craftsman bungalows are the most popular of the period here in Southern California in the teens. And it fits into the marketing of this idea of the perfect suburb. And at this point, Pasadena was called out from LA as the perfect suburb. They sort of hit the gang, so everybody would like to say, we're the Pasadena of San Diego, right? So you get that going. And if you look at here, those two tracks on the west side of Spring Street, the Grable track and the Lookout Park track, are really where they get. And that's today where we have the Dade Avenue Historic District, for example, right? So you can sort of see that in the streets there as the lots climb up the hill, a little harder to build on, but the ones down low in the flats where the orchards have been start coming in first. And of course, Dade Avenue is also sold off. They go in and they plant all the date palm trees. They have laid it all out, and you're seeing, sort of this idyllic sort of suburban lifestyle that they're trying to sell to folks here in La Mesa. So one of those guys who comes out and buys into this is a guy named Henry Lee Russell and his wife Emma. They're from Maine, and once again, they come out this time with brother-in-law Charles Noyes and Emma's sister Gertrude. Noyes is going to open the pharmacy, and Henry's going to open a butcher shop, which is usually how most architects get into the business. Is they start as a butcher and then they move into architecture. Okay, and contracting, right? That's how it works. Anyway, so they're both there as a congregational church, but they ended up, and it's interesting enough because there's an article that he sells his business to John Schlatter, because he's being asked to start building houses, right? And so he ends up extending the butcher shop as part of the deal with Schlatter, and then goes in and builds his own house on Dade Avenue, there's newspaper articles here, in April of 1911 for him and his family, his wife Emma and their young son Lawrence, and they began to move into the contracting business. Interesting enough, they start another house down the street, which is the house in this photograph here, which is going to be our tour house that I'll talk about. It's a larger house, and it's just down the street, and he's building that as well. And in the meantime, there's an article that says that Russell is also building a house for Dr. Charles Sampson. And there seems to be some confusion during the inventory work in the 1980s that sort of get us going on this, that this is probably the house here, and I'll tell you why that sort of assumption has come up, right? Now, but first, who is this Dr. Sampson guy? Well, he turns out to be a kind of important guy too, right? He comes out here from Nebraska with his wife Ida and their young son Vernon, and he buys one of those 10-acre lots out, is roughly about where Glen meets La Mesa Boulevard, out near sort of where Lemon Avenue School, in that area. And he ends up building a house and starting to plant it out. And so, but he's also an MD. He's a doctor, a physician. And so he actually, the first 2 years, what's his profession as retired, and then later a farmer, and then doctor. So he was sort of juggling all this. And he's one of those interesting guys in that because as a physician, he was so well respected, they sort of laud him. So when the city goes to incorporate, they sort of convince him, because if you read my article to know, he was actually, when the first announcement, hey, we should incorporate, he actually wrote a letter saying, I'm not sure we should do this. He was actually a dissenter at first, not sure we should do this. But they sort of talk him into it. He ends up flipping over to the other side, and then they nominate him to be on the board of trustees, and he's elected. And then at that time, and this is the way it worked in the city from 1912 to 1962, is board of trustees then voted amongst us for the president, and the president they voted for was Charles Sampson. The guy that wasn't sure to incorporate becomes the de facto mayor, first mayor of La Mesa, right? So he was well respected in all this, and that's the sort of ad. And he's also going to be key, and along with Sherman Grable, he's going to help form the irrigation district in 1913, which I'll tell a little more of that story later, which is really key to why La Mesa and Lemon Grove and El Cajon are still independent and not been subsumed by the city of San Diego, okay? Right, So, okay, so the inventory guys said, well, wait, there's a couple reasons. We think this was Charles Sampson's house. It's on Dade Avenue, but all this documentation says he owned stuff over there. What's going on with this story, right? And so when the owners came, and we did this research about 10 years ago or so, helping them out, can't seem to find any documentation to connect Sampson to this property. There's a note on that photograph that was written on it that says, oh, this is Dr. Sampson's house. He was the first mayor. We checked the records, who donated the photo, and couldn't get anything of where did this get written down, right? There's the notes that are in there that basically, when they researched the property, they did a rough title search using the indexes, and they noted that in 1913, Russell to Sampson mortgage. Oh, okay, he must have owned it because there's a mortgage, right? And so they conclude in their draft that this appears to be the house that Russell, in those articles in the newspaper saying Russell's building a house for Sampson, this must be the house, right? In the meantime, the county building record doesn't show up with improvements until 1914, which would make most folks think, well, it probably wasn't built till 13. That's sort of how tax records work. Usually, if you see a date, property was built before, and then the tax assessor catches up because they want to send you the tax bill. And so, but that usually means the property's been built probably the year before. So here we go, okay. So what were the things against this being the Sampson house? Well, one, we checked both city tax records and deed records and all, and Russell owns the property the whole 10 years up until 1922 when he finally sells it, right? Did those searches, right? Nothing in the scout area that brings Sampson, ever says they lived there, ever says Ida lived there, none of it, right? Because the photo also noted that this is Ida Sampson and son Vernon on the note, okay? Right? So, and in the 1910 census as well, Sampson's living on his ranch with his family. So where is this coming from, right? So who is it? What is it referencing, this article that says Russell's building a house for Sampson? Well, thanks to the old San Diego Sun again, it's this house. Never seen a picture of it until I found this article. And there's several articles noting that Russell is building that house for Sampson on his ranch, not in Dade Avenue. Now, there may be some other things that could mean that it's not impossible that is a picture of Ida and her son on the ranch, especially considering that Charles isn't in the picture. Because what we're going to find out a couple years later, even though Charles was extremely influential, they decide to move back to Nebraska in 1917. In 1918, he sells the property, the ranch property, to someone else. In the meantime, they own a bunch of property up on Mount Nebo and other places, and that's all settled in 1921 as part of the divorce between Ida and Charles. So it's quite possible that maybe they did need a second place for someone to stay for a while, as things maybe not were going so hot. Because I will tell you, the 1920 census, they're still in the same house. By 1922, they're both remarried to somebody else. So who knows? But pretty sure that we don't have any hard evidence still that this is Sam's house. But as I told them, they don't have to take the name off the plaque. It's okay. Just take a deep breath. But we'll get there. And who knows? Maybe something will pop up in the future that will allow us to confirm or clear it out. But anyway, the other little piece was that mortgage. And this is where we get to all our real estate friends help us out, right? When I actually pulled up, the index says Russell to Sampson, but when I actually pulled the mortgage up, the mortgagers are Russell and the mortgagee, the lender, is Sampson. So what happened was Sampson loaned Russell $1,000 using the property as the collateral. Doesn't mean he owned it. He gave him a loan with the property as collateral. Doesn't mean anything else that. So another place on why we always got to look at those primary sources, historians, right? To make sure we understand what it actually means and what's going on at the same time. The next owners who lived here were the Sprungs, or the next sort of long-term. He was worked for the school district. He actually was one of the first principals at La Mesa Junior High School as well, and his wife was a teacher. He passed actually fairly early, 1953, but she lived here until the 80s, and it's a wonderful house and is just gorgeous. You are going to absolutely adore this house when you get a chance to see it. It's been massively, wonderfully restored. The landscape and the backyard, all that's just fantastic. And you're going to enjoy what looks like just a nice little craftsman house that's turned into that. So that helps us with Mr. Russell and some of that stuff. And so let's get into the next house, is the Caldwell house. And as I want to say, not all houses are built big. A lot of these houses were built by speculators and folks who were looking maybe for more like a winter home or something. And the Grable House sort of falls into this. It also sort of understands how this was built, and one of the cutting edge things that Park Grable were trying to do to sort of keep the property values up. And these are things called deed restrictions. And in the case of this property, the deed restriction said one, it needed to have at least a 20-foot setback from the street. The house had to be situated equally between the lines of the property, and it must cost no less than $1,000. These are what typical things. Deed restrictions were just getting started in the aughts, in the early of 1967. We believe that some of the first were done in Cleveland. And the idea was to protect the property value, not only of the houses, but the surrounding neighborhood, etc. Of course, we will all know that this is the Jim Crow era. Eventually, they're going to add other unpleasant things like only Caucasians can live here, only Christians can live here, deed restrictions that will all be made illegal in 1948 by the Supreme Court during a case that was set up in Watts when an African-American family challenged and won that case that it was unconstitutional. But these were things that were sort of part of that. And so they were really trying to make sure they could create a place that had some value and lasting stuff. And this house was a guy from Vancouver, him and his wife. They were sort of semi-retired. He had been a businessman, and he ended up working down here as an underwriter, a mortgage company executive, et cetera. It starts buying up and speculating on properties, buying a lot, building a house, moving on. This was one of those. In the Sun, we find lots of references to him building this lovely house in 1912, of which matches up to the tax records. Still no contractor, probably one of the 3 or 4 guys I'm going to mention here today, probably built it, but no documentation on that. But a lovely little house, right? They sell it in 1915 and move on to another house to an interesting couple. I mentioned this. This is kind of fun. Mrs. Bradley, who the Bradleys bought this, was a little girl in Illinois and claims, of course, to have shook the hand of Abraham Lincoln when she was a child. And when she moved to Chicago with her first husband, was friends with a couple of interesting people, Susan B. Anthony and Jane Addams of the whole house. So working in pretty good circles. They moved to Florida first to retire, realizing this is, remember, pre-air conditioning. They come out here after that, right? And they live here for a few years. The house was not a big house to start with. And basically by the 30s, most of the folks living were renting this house out over time. A couple of an English native accountant named Barrett lived there, and a Scottish machinist named Lonnie also lived there for a while. The current owner purchased the house about 25 years ago and did an amazing job of restoring the inside, this beautiful craftsman house, fixed up the yard, added an addition to the back that you can't even see from the street, is just wonderful, and put in some period landscaping. And so this is another one that's just going to dazzle you who've never been in this house. Just beautiful woodwork. He also does some really beautiful art that you'll be able to see as well in the house. Just a fantastic addition to our tour. Now our buddy Lee Russell comes back. He's interesting enough. I don't know what this butchering thing got to him, but he actually moves to Calexico in 1914-15 and tries to open another butcher shop in Calexico. After a couple years in the desert, remember, pre-air conditioning, they come back to La Mesa, and the only decent photos I could find was actually from a costume party at the Congregational Church. There's Lee as he went by, and his wife Emma, and they were involved in many different civic groups, not only the church, but other civic groups. He was a Mason and etc. And so they end up moving out to a nicer house off of Date and eventually living out near Grossmont up into the 20s and 30s. And he also partners up with another guy by the name of David Marker in the early 20s to get his contracting business going. And in fact, Marker and Russell are going to partner for about 5 years. They're going to build some of the most notable buildings in the area from that early 20s period. And they continued on. And, they were sort of the big time developers. The drugstore is just one of many business buildings they built at this period. They also built many nice homes, etc. Now, Marker is that prolific early contractor. He actually had a background. His father was a carpenter in Virginia. He ends up moving to Colorado for a while, then moving with second wife Nellie and his son William out here. Starts the same thing, buying a few lots, building houses, selling them, moving on to the next one kind of thing. He does that. And some of the most important buildings in the history of La Mesa, including the first women's club, the Worth House, and the Harry Park's house and others, were built. And this is just a smattering of all the houses that Marker and Russell would build in La Mesa during these early years, the teens and 20s. And the 20s, of course, kicks in another boom. La Mesa had been steadily growing up to this point, but Southern California gets another big boom in the 20s after World War I. People want to get out here and engage. There's new industries. There's the petroleum industry. There's the entertainment industry. Things are happening. And here in San Diego, the Navy and the military becomes a big factor in bringing people as well. And so things are happening. The communities are growing, and more subdivision and more such as Calabo Gardens out in Nat Helix, et cetera, La Mesa Highlands, the Country Club Tract, et cetera. This leads us to another couple that comes out looking for that new life due to health stuff. But the property itself was owned by a couple of ladies, which is an interesting one, right? Annie Temple and Jane Judson, who buy up a lot and you name it Colina del Sol, and get up this idea that they're going to go ahead and build a bunch of cottages here. And they sit up on this lovely ridge that looks out south towards the downtown, and they're going to do this. As far as I can tell, neither ever married. They knew each other. I'm not 100% sure if there's a relationship, cousin or something there, but somehow they come up. Jane was known for her artwork and did some theater. Annie just worked in various different jobs and had enough money to be able to be part of this property and have these cottages built. And it's pretty clear that Marker and Russell built these cottages for them. They're lovely craftsman-style cottages. The one you'll have on the tour is the one that's remaining. The other two are gone now. But very interesting sort of thing. So this is, I think, the Colina del Sol, right? Now, there's another little interesting piece of this is that there's one of those lovely public staircases that gets up to this property. And of course, I remember when it went for sale a couple years ago and went to the open house, and the real estate agent, historian, I've heard that the stairs were put in because the mayor used to live here and needed to get into downtown fast. So, wow, that's a good one.
That's fun.
But it sounds fun, though, doesn't it? Well, there's a lot. Well, yeah, no mayors have ever lived in this house. Some interesting people, but no mayors. And by the way, they did this because they hadn't built the road up to the back up the ridge. And so that was easier to get into. You just came down and you parked in. In fact, for the first few years, the address of this house was on the street below, not later street, what it is now. So lots of fun, a little local lore that sneaks in here once in a while, that kind of thing. So one of those little fun hidden staircase stories, right? Okay, so owners of Cottage 2, this is our house, John and Charlotte King. John's an industry guy, New York native, did pretty well in business in Rochester, ends up moving to Montclair, New Jersey, where he meets the somewhat younger Charlotte, about 15 years younger. They end up getting married, and they arrive here in La Mesa around 1921 because John's doctors told him, you need to get out of this bad weather. You need to get, you got some health issues, right? Which we'll hear about in a minute. So does pretty well. And he gets out of here, but he doesn't retire. He jumps right into it. He's a golfer. He joins the brand new country club, which at that time was a 9-hole dirt fairway course over here in Spring Valley with a nice country club at the top. And he gets into that, and you see his name about that. His wife joins the women's club. And he opens a real estate and insurance business and begins to heavily promote La Mesa, not only around locally, but to his friends back in New Jersey and New York, and actually gets people to come move out here and actually buy lots and build houses. And so he's this guy that suddenly the community's, this is an active guy. We really are excited about having Mr. King here, right? And he's just jumped right into the middle of it, right? Unfortunately, comes May 12th, 1924. At this time, the 3 cottages are residents of Annie and Jane, John and Charlotte in the second one, and Mr. Crawford and his wife, along with their school teacher daughter, Ms. Margaret Wieben, are living in the third one. This is a rough day, and I've already talked to the owners. They know there's no curse. But basically, Crawford goes downtown. He's having some health issues. He reportedly collapses while he's crossing a trolley track, falls, breaks his neck, and passes away. A phone call comes down. Hey, get Margaret. She needs to come downtown to deal with all this, the daughter. John, being the friendly neighbor, says, I'll drive you. I have an automobile. I'll pull up. He pulls the car up in front of the store where she was at and has a coronary and passes out, dies in the car. So like I say, sometimes we get some really interesting stories and some you try to scratch your head. Wow, right? Luckily, we have no record of anybody else dying in that house and everything. And it's a beautiful house, but just, you never know what you're going to run into when you start digging into house histories. And there's an interesting one. Now, I'll just tell you that Charlotte will continue to be a very important person in the community. She's a long-time officer and person in the women's club. She works with churches and those other things. She's very involved. And she lives there until 1956 when she finally passes away. She even had her mom move out with her after Don passed away and lived out here for a while. There were several other owners, very interesting, but probably the most interesting, which is one of note, was when Raymond and Florence Ueda moved into the house in 1978. They lived there for about 14 years. Raymond worked for the county, but we ended up connecting the fact that his wife, Florence, was one of those Japanese-American families here in the area that was interned during World War II. In fact, we had done some research on all those families, and it's hard to see her picture. I pulled it out of a little screen in the Grossmont yearbook. All of her siblings graduated from Grossmont. Florence wasn't able to. She was only a sophomore when they were taken out to internment. But just one of those things that triggered to tell if you never know what the story is, and it was always good because not a lot of those families came back to the area, but it was clear that some of the Kitas were able to stay here. And so that's just a fun little story. And there's that magical staircase that you might see there. So all kinds of interesting things that we come out when we start in the house. And of course, it is an amazing house. It is a gorgeous landscape. I don't know, are you out there, Bobby and Katie? Are you out there? No? Purchased 3 years ago by this young couple. Massive, just wonderful folks. They're very nice. They're Canadian. They're very nice people. Don't cross-check Katie, but other than that, because she'll take the penalty minutes, but they're very nice people, okay? So there's my Canadian plug today on that. So we had the other guy, and that's go Canadian. And Rush is back to is going to tour again. So, all of us guys who really have Canadian history we're excited about that. So anyway, so the King House is there. It's just wonderful, wonderful example and well updated home, right? Okay, so I mentioned water is important, right? And it certainly is. And the Flume Company that I mentioned to you actually went into foreclosure in 1899 during that drought. The English bondholders held it and just sort of tried to keep it going. They were having trouble fulfilling their water contracts because there wasn't water. They were just trying to make it work. And in 1911, Ed Fletcher, who had just opened his Grossmont property and was eyeing all that property that now will become Fletcher Hills, connects with a Montana capitalist by the name of James Murray. They then offer up to the bond company to purchase the Flume Company's assets. They rename the company the Cuyamaca Water Company and start it off. They are going to spend a lot of money trying to fix it up. They end up putting that big concrete dam in front of the little earthen dam of the old Mesa Reservoir, expands its capacity, and in the effort, keep trying to sell the company to the city of San Diego, who should be their largest client, saying, well, you guys need to have this. But there was this long-standing thing with the city, and their attorneys in the early teens realized that due to the Pueblo rights that go back to the original Mexican grants, the water of the San Diego River should belong to the city of San Diego. So they tell Fletcher, we're not buying from you. We're taking it in court. That's our water. We don't have to buy anything from you guys. This is going to turn into a 19-year lawsuit, okay? So in the meantime, all the folks who are being served here by this are worried. And so in 1925, led by the local newspaperman C.S. Smith, a bond act is put out to the folks who live within the irrigation district boundary. By the way, the irrigation district was a dry district when it was established in 1913. It had no water source. And up until 1925, it has no water source. It's buying water. That's the only way it can get water into the system to serve its constituents, right? That all changes with this passage that gives the district the money to buy the Cuyamaca Water Company, and they now have the water source and the rights and all the improvements of the old Flume Company, water company, to be able to control that. And this is all the wonderful photo. There's lots of photos of passing the check to Mr. Fletcher. Hey, we got water. And this is really an important story locally. And a guy who's key to that is a guy named Chester Harrett. Harrett's a fascinating guy, grew up, was born in Julian, big family, got interested in irrigation and engineering, goes off and gets his engineering degree. And when the Cuyamaca Water Company buys the Flume Company, he gets the job as the first engineer and eventually rises up to be the manager. And when the property is transferred to the irrigation district, becomes the manager, the directing manager of the irrigation district. Now, the La Mesa, Lemon Grove, Spring Valley Irrigation District, it's a big one, right? That's why they changed it to Helix. Helix Irrigation District, Helix Water, right? Just too many words. So that's right. So he's really key in this. So in the meantime, finally in 1929, the court rules and says, okay, City of San Diego, you're right. You own the water, but you have to pay the irrigation district for their improvements and their property. And you got to work out a deal for servicing them. Can't cut them off. And the guy who's the main sort of negotiator for this is Chet Harrod. And Chet sort of works the deal out that basically says, fine, we'll sell you Lake Murray, we'll sell you the dam site at El Capitan, we'll give you all this other stuff, but we always get the last 2 feet of water. If you have to shut the taps off, you have to shut San Diego off first, the irrigation district second. Of course, they weren't worried about that, but they just say, yeah, okay, whatever. But in reality, that water independence is why no annexations of La Mesa, Lemon Grove, El Cajon could happen by the city, because we didn't need the city, because we had that magic elixir here, water, the thing that gives us independence to be in. And so this was a real key piece of this, right? And of course, he's going to go on to continue to work. He actually works till he passes away in 1948 as the director of the irrigation district. And he's also key in setting up the water authority that's going to make the deal with the Metropolitan Water to get that big pipe that now brings the 90-something% of our water from somewhere else, so that we can have 3.5 million people live in this county. It's always been estimated that natural sources, population of San Diego County should be around 400,000 if we just had local sources. We have 3.5 million. So we are a little bit adapted species when it comes to water around here. And he's a key guy to help us make sure that could occur. Now, of course, in many of those years, Chet and his wife, Annie, they lived in housing provided by the irrigation district. Finally, in 1935, they have the resources to build their own house, right? And of course, obviously, Chet is an important person in the community. He's well known. His status. His wife is as well. She's part of the Grossmont High PTA. She's in the drama club. She's in the women's club. They're very, very fun. And they wanted to have a house that befit their status and style, right? And of course, this is the interwar era where we talked about all those craftsman houses stuff, but in between, in the 20s, 30s, the revival styles become extremely popular here, especially in San Diego after the Exposition, the Spanish and Mediterranean styles, which was promoted almost exclusively. So like if you come to my community neighborhood, Kensington, it's like 85% Spanish Mediterranean, a few Tudors, but pretty much because that was sort of San Diego's identity coming off that, promoted by architects like Richard Greco and others, right? So you get to see that. And here, of course, within La Mesa, you're seeing the revival styles being really popular, okay? And so they turned to a fellow by the name of William Henry Wheeler. Another fascinating story here, another Canadian connection. He was born in Australia. Born in Australia, 1874. His mother realized he has an interest in architecture. She gets an apprentice as a teenager. The folks in Australia tell him, this is too small, you need to get out of here. They send him to Vancouver, BC, part of the Commonwealth, to get him up there. And he then some more works as an apprentice again for another architect who tells him, you need to get your degree, you need to get into this, you've got the skills to do this. He moves to San Francisco so he could attend UC Berkeley, which at the time had probably one of the largest architecture programs certainly in the Western U.S. Most of our National Park Service architects, all those folks came out of the program at Berkeley. They had connections to the Beaux Arts School in France and stuff. So like people like, you may have heard of Julia Morgan, one of the first. She was at Berkeley. They sent her to France to be trained at Beaux Arts to come back and take on a few fun projects like, I don't know, Hearst Castle and some other things in Line, which is a state historic park, rather. And so Wheeler has a similar thing. He comes down, he does that. He ends up meeting someone. They get married. They take the young family to Arizona in 1906 with his degree and his license. And unfortunately, his wife passes away, and he's looking to get a change. Once again, Arizona before air conditioning. He decides to come to San Diego because in 1912, all the exposition work is happening, and lots of designers and architects are coming to San Diego because there's work. They're building all these buildings. They're doing all this work for Balboa Park. He ends up coming in, and he ends up getting his first job is to work for a developer called McFadden Buxton, who's starting a new little subdivision that's in between South Park and North Park called Burlingame. If any of you have gone to the red sidewalks of Burlingame, that's a lovely little teens, 20s neighborhood there. And one of his first houses was for Henry Wegeforth, who started the zoo, and that was one of his first little projects he did once he got here. He grows his firm, partners up with another architect, John Siebert, and becomes extremely prolific. And I mean, the list would be way too long for a couple of slides, just amazing. But to give you an example, the Balboa Theater is a William Henry Wheeler, right? As well as in La Mesa, the Erickson Mortuary is a Wheeler. Now, by 1935, Siebert's passed on, and so Wheeler's looking to just sort of do small amounts of work, and he partners up with an important contracting company called the Dennstedts, and that's how this gets to the story, right? And the Dennstedts come to San Diego in 1924 as the boom's hitting and become probably the largest of the contractors in the period of when it was still spec house style, right? You came in, bought lots, built individual houses versus post-war track where you come in and build them all, right, at one time and then sell them. The market wasn't there yet. The financing wasn't there. And he ends up, and the Dennstedts then are this and they're doing lots of stuff. And you can find their houses anywhere from Del Mar to Point Loma, Mission Hills, Rolando, El Cerrito, La Mesa, Mount Helix. They're all over, right? They are just doing houses everywhere. And we've had a few of their houses be listed, including the Hyatt one over in La Mesa Highlands from the same period, etc. So this is what's going on with this, right? And it works out that from 34 to 36, Dennstedt hires Wheeler and uses his little promotional that, hey, we'll build your house and we'll have William Wheeler design it for you too. This is what happens at the Harrod House, right? This is one of those that we were able to confirm. And so Harrod's house being built is the news, right? And of course, it is a fascinating piece of Spanish eclectic, mid-30s style architecture, lots of things. And if you don't know about Wheeler, his son, Richard, becomes also a prolific architect, starts up in the late 30s. And if you were on the tour last year, one of the Wheeler houses was on the tour, becomes a master of mid-century style in the 50s and 60s, building just gorgeous stuff. So there's a long legacy. And the grandson, Jim, is also an architect. I don't know if Jim's here. And so just an amazing legacy of some guy starting in Australia, ends up moving around, finally getting here and building a few houses for us here in La Mesa. The Harrods leave the house in the mid-40s. As I said, I think it was 1948 that Chet ends up passing away, and he was still working as the head of the water district at that point. Another interesting was the second owner here at this house was a retired lieutenant. And we see this a lot in San Diego, both in the interwar and post-war. A lot of houses I see kids I do research on and other places right here, retired military officers. And that was Lieutenant Commander Thomas Colburn, USN, retired, who ends up becoming, in his retirement, a key person in building the recreation programs here in the city of La Mesa. He's one of the first recreation commissioners. He helps fund all the fundraising for the first building in MacArthur Park, which is the youth building, which was completed in 1948. It's the one just the west of the 1980s community center, and helps push that, as well as also pushing to support youth sports programs and recreation programs. So that was sort of his secondary, and was very well known, a member of the time which the Republican Party, so he was involved in that group, which was dominating at that period in La Mesa's political history at that time. And so very important person in that. And of course, many other interesting owners as well. It's just a fascinating piece of art and artisanship, eclecticness, and I tell you, I don't think any room's on the same level, so just watch your step. And it's just a wonderful landscape and tucked into an interesting little lot there with a great view out towards downtown. All right, so let's get this wrap. Here's our last little property to finish up with you for. Right, and we're back to our friends at the Methodist Episcopal Church, right? And of course, church architecture at the time in the teens did all right here, teens, early 20s here in La Mesa. Emma Brooke Weaver's extremely modern 1911 church for the Congregational is still on Third. We believe, obviously, that he's got some influence here from his colleague, Mr. Gill, in creating a building with very austere. He is also known for doing things like the Grossman Inn, which is a craftsman gem. So Weaver's certainly doing something like that sort of fit into where Gill was doing with his church architecture, which was also these very austere and clean buildings. There's, of course, the Baptist Church from 12. If you were on the tour a couple years ago, we talked about this through St. Martin's, and Los Angeles architect James Roach, who designed that building. That building's since been moved to their new site. And of course, then the new Congregational Church, which was finished in 23 by Louis Gill, who was related to Irving, but he's not the same. But he was a very good architect, very impressive architect, who did a Spanish colonial for the Congregational Church, right? So lots of good architecture for the churches around here. So, of course, La Mesa Methodist goes to their conference and says, hey, can you help us out? We're going to need some financing. We know we need to grow. The community's growing a lot. And in our congregation, we need a bigger building than that little building across the street, right? And so they end up going and they're told, well, we've got the guy for you. His architect's named Arthur G. Lindley. He lives in Glendale. I've actually been approached by several different historians, one who's actually thinking about writing a book about him. There's at least 200 commissions we can confirm to Lindley, the majority of course, in the Los Angeles region. But he was at the time sort of the preferred architect for the Methodist Church of Southern California, and ends up doing quite a few, not just in Glendale, but I mean, this is once again just a short list of all of the properties. There's only two we can confirm down here. One, the Escondido Church, which was completed in 21, and the church right next to us here, right? So Lindley, very important, very prolific architect. And of course, the cornerstone was laid in 1921. The community here grows with it, right? There's the sketch of it. And it's under construction there. And of course, as you can see, that's the piece that sits right on the corner there, the first part of the property. And it was dedicated in April of 1922 when the first services were held in the building next door, which also had some classrooms and other things because there was interest at that time to starting a school. So very important. This was certainly another one of those landmarks buildings that sort of set it to everybody, gets everything from postcards to, to wonderful shots and promotions from the business community. This just gorgeous and a very typical of the sort of mission/Spanish architecture that was popular in the early 20s here, and that information coming from architect Lindley. A few other shots, including the old interior. A lot of this was going to be remodeled, so it doesn't quite look like that inside anymore, but just giving you one of those rare things, a color photo from pre-1950. We do have a few, not too many. But anyway. So, of course, the community doesn't stop growing. In fact, after World War II, just like all of San Diego, La Mesa is going to see exponential growth. In 1940, the population was about 4,000. By 1950, it's 11,000. By 1960, it'll be 30,000, right? So you're seeing this growth, and of course, that's going to affect the institutions like the churches. They're getting more congregants, they need more space, and they need to expand. So they turned to a guy named Frank Harrington. He's a local architect, San Diego-based, veteran, as many folks as well, got his degrees and all. And he comes in, and he has another guy that when I dig into it, find out that he probably did about 50 or 60 churches in his design career, which is a pretty big number if you think about it, including many Methodist churches in this early 50s especially. In fact, the one article shows that he has 6 plans together for churches and another 5 in construction. This is in 1954. So he's clearly somebody who churches, as you think, this guy knows how to design churches, right? And we're standing in his one right here. This is the one completed in 1955. And certainly has the elements of the Spanish sort of influence, but in a more contemporary interpretation at the same time, which is really what was going on after the war. Not modern and stuff, but certainly contemporary in the way he's interpreting the Spanish influence and the eclecticness, right? So there. And of course, he did churches all over, including Wesley Methodist, if you know it, up at 54th and El Cajon, and even did the church for the African-American community down in Southeast at the Bethel AME, which was also done around the same time. There's a little sketch. It was about a 5-year project for the church to raise the funds and get this going and get property. Local contractor, Reha Construction, used to have their shop right up in the industrial zone over here. I'm not sure if they're still in business, but a contractor from the 30s at least up until the last 10 years or so, got the job. And the bids come out, and of course, it was built. It included not only the sanctuary, but also new schoolrooms to expand the school. And those were important pieces to the story here, right? Just a few more shots when it opened in May of 1955, as well as the organ, which is really, you mentioned, right? So if you look at this map, you can sort of see the original 20s church there, and then the expansions in the 55 to really create a campus. Eventually that property, they're going to get the property just the side that used to be the Buick auto shop. It's now part of the school over here. And so taking up this whole sort of corner of the property. And of course, still landmarks, of course, here in the community and the institution celebrating its 130th anniversary helps us all out, right? And so as Christian said, definitely come back and get to see all of the rest of the old campus and the old sanctuary. It was remodeled a little bit when it was converted to more of the school operations, but there's still lots of interesting details in there, as well as all of the other history that we have here at the Methodist Church. And I'll just sort of wrap with, of course, somebody else is having that anniversary, and that, of course, is us at the La Mesa History Center, formed in 1975. This is our 50th anniversary, and so we'll just give you that. And of course, the History Center starts out as a historical society at a time when local history just burgeoned across the U.S. And what was that trigger? The U.S. bicentennial effort. This was a huge effort for local history. You see many hundreds of historical societies and such groups created in that period around the 1976 bicentennial. And I hear that maybe the Freedom Train didn't come to San Diego. It came to San Jose. I got to get on it. I don't know if any of you remember the Freedom Train. Did you? Oh, some Freedom Train people. Okay, good. You could look through the glass at the Liberty Bell. It was exciting. All right. So anyway, so the big push, right? And of course, this is when public history, my profession, I've been practicing now for the non-academic historical professions, archivists, historians, state park interpreters, all those kinds of professions are coming to develop because there's a need also in environmental law to protect these newfangled things called historical resources. Properties, are they eligible to be listed? They're part of the environment. Can they be affected? And those kinds of things. So it's really grown. Other things that trigger people often, there's a couple of really good articles and discussions about how important the miniseries Roots was to not just explain that there's other narratives in American history, but that everybody's history, everybody's genealogy, right, is there for you to go find out and dig into. What I do a lot for people who come to us at the sister to look up their house and who are these people? What are they about? Where do they come from? Did one fall over dead of a heart attack? What was that about? What are you talking about, right? So those kinds of things that are just part of what we brought in. And so this is the beginning of that profession. And here in La Mesa, there had been a pioneer group, which was sort of like a reunion group of families who could claim that they went back to the incorporation date. That was roughly what if you were been around long enough, they'd let you in anyway. But their group, we used to meet and have picnics and sort of that kind of thing, the old La Mesans, including a guy who was Thomas Donahue's, I think, his son, Lloyd, who was a founding member of what would become the La Mesa Historical Society. And there was actually a bicentennial committee that helped put together a little booklet there and do some other things and start gathering information that's going to create the need for the Historical Society. And here we are, and we incorporated on October 6th, just a couple days ago, it was 50, right? So we're very excited to that and did some of the projects that we've done. And they used to have they do tours and ice cream socials and began to then build up the archive and all that kind of stuff. And found the McKinney house to be available. At this point, the only person living there was the youngest son, Donald. He had never married. A deal was made through one of the board members to then transfer the property to the Historical Society. Donald's original job was to open it on Saturdays. He could live there, and he would open it for tours on Saturday afternoons. If you wonder why we did Saturday afternoons. Once he got a little bit older and he needed to move on, the society fully took it over, restored it to its 1908 condition. There had been some additions and things, and got it listed once the city created its historical preservation ordinance as landmark number 1 in 1985. So just part of that sort of quick history there of how we got going. And of course, as it's going to be on the tour, come check it out. And of course, like I said, what we do is very much more the archives has become a very big part of what we do. And our president, Veronica Martzel, is a professional archivist. I'm a professional historian. We have all our volunteers who come to help us try to get this stuff cataloged and get it available so that when someone comes in, we can hopefully find that answer as people going, I know it's buried in there somewhere. It's in the box somewhere. We're trying to get all of that going, and we have our SDSU interns that are going to help us with stuff as well. And we try to keep that all going so that we get that. And of course, recently we've done some changes to the landscape, trying to bring back this little postage stamp piece of what that citrus pre-suburban landscape was when this was a ranch. And as you get out there, you'll see it's we don't have the lawn and all that anymore because we're trying to get it back to that. And of course, we have our lemon trees and drop those off in the boxes for folks who want to get a few lemons, right? Fun stuff. And the things we're doing, which is, of course, things like the roundtables, like you're here today, publications, and the home tour. Is that why we're here today? All right. The other thing to let you know is that we don't cover just the city. We cover what we call the greater La Mesa area, the unincorporated areas to the east, like Mount Helix, Grossmont, et cetera, as well as just since I had started the College Neighborhoods project when I lived in Rolando, that archive is now, that group since disbanded. So those archives are being incorporated here into this because they have a lot of history. Remember, that's where the original La Mesa was. Those neighborhoods, some of them are in San Diego now, some of them are in La Mesa now. All that to try to explain that this is a connected history that we have here that we can help promote, as well as working with our partners at El Cajon Historical, Lemon Grove Historical, Spring Valley, etc. So speaking of that tour, just in case, we're doing something a little different this year. For the first time, we're offering a few select tickets for our special Friday night tour. And you say, what Friday night tour? Well, previously, we've done this. This is one of the perks we give to our very generous owners who open their houses to all of you, is that we do a little reception on Friday night where we take the owners around to see the other houses so that they can stay with their house and answer the 4,000 questions they're going to get from all the cool people saying, this is an awesome house. What did you get that? Whatever, right? How did you do that? So that includes sort of a little tour with me. I give a little more tour, so not this much tour, but enough tour that you can understand the history of the house, and there's a reception. So if you're so kind, and of course all these funds help us, The home tour is our number one fundraiser. This is how we are able to subsidize a lot of the things we do and make sure we have the resources. Just the other day, somebody came and brought us a bunch of photos they found in an estate sale from Kansas. We found out there was a historical society in Kansas. They wanted the photos, and so we shipped them off to them, right? Little costs, but it helps us cover the bills, keep the copy machine running, the lights on, the water bill, all those things that even though we get property taxes, a nonprofit, off the blip, we still got to pay the rest of the bills. So if you're interested, let us know. You can sign up for tickets online or you can check in. The other thing is we still need a few more docents, and I know some of you out there are docents who are getting your indoctrination today. If there's anybody else, please pass the word, have them send in to us. We could use a few more, always can use a few more, and to help buff out and so that everybody has a great time and we can help our visitors get through the tour house safely and enjoy their experience. Because what we do in our tour is what we call freestyle touring. So the folks will come into the check-in, which will be at the public city lot over here, right? You get on the shuttles and the shuttles will roll around because there's no way we could let 300 cars go out and park on these streets. Certainly this year isn't as bad as some, but it just doesn't work. We need people to take the shuttles so that we can make sure we keep the flow going and don't get any complaints that might not let us have a home tour in the future. And so we appreciate all that. And so just know that that's all part of what we're doing. And that freestyling is really great. So the person isn't being ran through in 5 minutes. If they want to spend an hour at that house, they can spend an hour. They want to spend 10 minutes, they can. Just know that the doors lock up at 3, right? That's sort of our thing. So it allows people to move at their pace, sit down, ask those questions of the owners or whoever, and just get sort of into it and enjoy it and have a wonderful visit to some gorgeous homes and properties here in La Mesa. So, oh man. Woo! Thank you for your patience, and I didn't see anybody nod off, so that's good. Certainly we have a little bit of time if there's any questions, so people may need to hit to the restroom or something, but if there's any questions anybody has? Yeah, sure. We did record this, yes. There was some information in there? I know. I always find these fun tips. I could just slide them in. I know I should dial it back sometimes, and you've all been very, like I said, nobody nodding off, so I appreciate that. It's happened. Trust me, it's happened. But yeah, I mean, it's just, and you never know. We also had 7 properties instead of last year we had 5, so that's a little bit longer. And of course, the 130-year history of this institution, our 50 years. And as I mentioned, I think our rodeo folks out there, they're celebrating their 100th this year. So a lot of exciting things going on, in the way of understanding and celebrating the history and sort of letting us go. And the tours are a great way for us to share that, one, we have just a wonderful history, but we also have an amazing architectural heritage here in La Mesa. We have the same architects and builders like you will see in La Jolla and Coronado and Kensington and Mount Healy, all those places, right? And so I think it's just another way to help explain that and really, get people to get in that there's some great value here in many ways for the community. So, any other? Yeah, sure. Yeah, it is. Yeah. So interesting enough, one of the things I didn't mention was that there was a young architect by the name of Richard Requa. You may have heard of him. He sort of became the major promoter of Spanish colonial architectural style in San Diego. He wrote books. I actually have a copy of one of his architect books after his trips to Spain and the Mediterranean that were sold out to architects so they'd have details of real buildings from back there. And so he had just left Gill's office in 1910, and in 1914 he was hired with his partner Reed to build that Mission Revival style grammar school. That school was built in 1914. It served as the only grammar school for Spring Valley and La Mesa till 1942 when Lemon Avenue and Spring Valley Elementary opened. Of course, after the war, they had to build 17 more schools. That's how fast things grew. And so that grammar school eventually was converted first to, I believe, the junior high till they built the junior high, La Mesa Junior High. It spent a couple years as the intermediate school, and then was down to the grammar school for a while, and then closed, I want to say in the early 70s, somewhere like that, I think. But yeah, so, and the only piece left is the little rec building next to the senior tower there. And then, of course, the school district still owned the land. They'd owned it since 1895, and they built, that's where the district offices are.
right over there, Orange and Date. Yeah, so there's that story. Yeah. Oh, you mean the MacArthur Park name? Oh, no, I don't think so. I think those were two separate things. Yeah, that's over in City Heights. Yeah, it's Fairmount Edition off of 54th. No, I think that was much later. No, the gals just like that name. They're interesting. I think Judson left. She ended up leaving in the late 20s, and Annie was there till the early 30s, I think. I didn't put the fun story. So Annie from her house there, of course, there on the ridge, you can see that. We can also see back out towards Coles Mountain, right? So when those freshmen, and I'm an SDSU alum, when those crazy freshmen from San Diego State put that big white S up on Coles Mountain, she wrote a very scathing editorial in the Union decrying the ugliness of how dare they allow them to do such a thing. And of course, now it's Mission Trails Park and they don't let you do it. We talked about one time doing a light up with flashlights one time. But yeah, we don't let them go out there and paint rocks in the habitat anymore of Mission Trails. But yeah, so yeah, no, I think that was just the name they decided to pick. And they actually subdivided that land a couple years later and eventually got that road up to the back, which is how you guys all drive up there. But anyway, yeah. Mm-hmm. Oh, Dennstedts were all over, yeah. Not as much. Well, I'll just say that the depth of the depression is really 30, 31. And you can see that in the number of permits and the activity really shrinks. By 35, there's a couple things. The first thing is the FHA has passed. And that's a huge, huge benefit to mostly working class people. Because what that did is the federal government said, banks, we will guarantee mortgages. So that massively opens the market. So previously to have a mortgage before the FHA, you had to have collateral. Usually the bank's not going to go, oh, that's a risky thing, building a house. Oh yeah, sure, we'll give you, here's $5,000, go build a house. Oh, what do you mean the contractor ran away halfway through it? I got nothing, right? So the federal government making that really opened the market. And this is really where the working class folk were able to get in and buy. And they were wonderful 1% 10-year loans. Even though you only made a couple bucks a week. But anyway, $100 a month or something, right? And pay your $30 mortgage. So that was a big thing. So the other thing is the military, the Navy did help San Diego. It didn't take as dip as some were, the manufacturing and other kinds of industries. So that helped steady it. And then the exposition in 35, 36, when they also brought in some attention and brought people. So Dennstedt and all those guys, by 34, 35, things are starting to, if you had the resource. Now, obviously, if you had been ruined and all that, that's a different thing. But you begin to see it pick up. The other thing that happened in 35 was the arrival of a guy named Reuben Fleet's little company, Consolidated Aircraft. Okay, and that was a huge step of San Diego joining what will become the big post-war and pre-war boom of Southern California, the aerospace industry, right? That was our connection. We had little Solar and we had little, right, and Ryan, but that really was a serious company, and Fleet was a major player. He knew all the folks to get those military contracts, and they become the number one private industry in San Diego, and that takes obviously through World War II. So those were some things that helped buoy San Diego a little bit over some of the other areas that were really hit much harder. And so by that point, so yeah, and Dennstedt's, in fact, a year later, they split into two companies. The two brothers just ran off and said, we're going to do our own stuff. And there are houses and their names. There's Dennstedt subdivisions in Rolando and College area. Two of the brothers lived in Kensington. I knew a couple. There's a Dennstedt tract next to Grossmont High, and you'll see a Dennstedt Street over there in El Cajon. So they were probably the largest of what we would call today sort of independent contractor companies. After the war, the one son, Norman, kept it going for a while. They consolidated back into one company. But by that point, you had the big corporates coming in to build tracks, like American Housing Guild and some of those companies who were coming in and building whole neighborhoods, right, up front and selling houses because the demand and the financing after the war allowed tract housing to come in. Yeah. He was trying to sell it in 1916. I think the ad said that that it cost $7,000 to build, which in 1910 is a fair chunk of money. Sometimes, yeah, it just depends on, like I said, it was interesting about the Grable House. I mean, and I knew the gal Karna who did the report in 85, and she's like, well, it sort of looks like a Gill, and it sort of feels like a Gill, and I can't find any darn facts to back this up, right? And so you just never know. There were plenty of articles, like I said, about happening, what they're planting in the grounds, how important, and you would have thought that at some point, Grable, as the marketing guy, would say, that's an Irving Gill. But at the same time, what a lot of people don't realize is Irving Gill's popularity fell pretty hard after his mess in Torrance. He got sued and other things. It was pretty bad. And he sort of goes underground for a while. Now, literally, most people didn't pay attention until Esther McCoy writes that, I think it was 1959, her little section said, this guy was like it. He had it figured out way before everybody else. He had sort of fallen off the map. So I don't know if there was, that was, why even bring it up that it's a Gill kind of thing. Because he didn't have the panache, I guess, to say it at that time. But your general question, yeah, it just depends. I think the house, $7,000 might have been the cost for Harriet's house too, something like in that range. Oh, yeah. That's correct, yeah. Yeah, so I did that a lot, and when I had the Rolando, I have all the database. My little house in Rolando, 1941, cost $3,150. The one across the street had the third bedroom. It was $3,300. And we joke with everybody, say, you can't even get re-roofed for that, right? Built the whole darn house, right? So, and the materials were much better. Yeah, so it's, well, you saw, even on the deed restriction on Date Avenue, $1,000 minimum, right? So by 25, my tract in Kensington Manor, I think the minimum was $2,500 in 1925. And they were looking for something a little higher end there. So it's all relative, of course. Like I said, sort of like the FHA, 10%. You make $100 a month and you're paying a $30 mortgage, or what you're supposed to. I mean, honestly, people, I spent some time as a plan commissioner, and I know these people are trying to figure out how to fix the housing. I'm telling you, I don't think any of these zoning things will do anything. But what could really help is figuring out how to finance people to buy property. You need a sort of FHA level fix so that folks who can make a mortgage but don't have $300,000 to put down, because that's now 20% of a property value here, how can those folks get into property? That's, to me, is where you could really fix a lot of this problem. It's more in how you can get people in than worrying about how you're going to get a contractor to spend all the money and then cut the price in half and not go under. I mean, this doesn't work that way. We'll see. There's always lots of interesting things going on with housing these days. Have I worn you out yet? All right. Any more questions? Hey, thanks to every of you and all of you who are docents. Thanks. And if you just bought tickets, thanks to you too. And otherwise, we'll see you. And thanks, of course, to the First United and Reverend Dement. And they're working on a big sort of preservation plan as well to see how to properly reuse this. So it's lots of good things going on around town here. So I just want to thank everybody for coming, and you're free.